Welcome back to another Geetsly's Xenobiology video, where we take a look at some of the most interesting species the galaxy has to offer. Normally, we like to take an in-depth look at species we have a lot of information on, such as the Twi'lek or the Wookiees, or even lesser-known species that nonetheless share a common trait, such as our video on the hive-minded species of the galaxy. In today's video, however, we're going to do something a little different. Instead of focusing on the most fleshed-out species, we'll instead take a look at some of the smaller, more obscure species that pop up from time to time. Many of them have incredibly interesting or unique features and deserve the spotlight for a few minutes, even if they don't warrant a dedicated video to themselves. So, with no further ado, let's dive into some of the lesser loved species of the Star Wars universe.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
The first species we'll be looking at today are the Shistavinen, or as we like to think about them, the Star Wars version of that one character from Beastars. These bipedal, furry mammals had lupine characteristics that earned them the nickname Wolfmen, and they really lived up to that nickname. The Shistavinen were native to Uvenna Prime, which was located in the Uvenna system of the Outer Rim. Uvenna was, in essence, what you'd imagine ideal wolfpack territory to be. Huge, forested continents separated by vast oceans, dotted with natural caves and mountain ranges. It had a warm, temperate climate. In short, it was Earth if humans had never evolved. Standing between 1 and 2 meters tall, Shistavinen were covered from head to toe in thick fur that was either black or brown. Their faces were especially wolf-like, with pronounced muzzles, sharp canine teeth, and red or yellow eyes that glowed in low light. Their ears were also pointed and erect, allowing them to hear prey as it moved through the forest. As you'd expect from wolves, they had sharp claws and fangs, a very keen sense of smell and hearing, and they could also maintain a lope for a long time, either on their hind legs or on all fours. Their sharp senses were also a weakness, however, making them sensitive to intense stimuli such as glaring lights or intense smells. Although they had naturally evolved on their homeworld, there were theories that they'd been victims of genetic engineers like the Rakata and the Celestials who had played with other races in the past. As a society, the Shistavinen were isolationists. That is to say, they thought their own kind was superior and they didn't want many dealings with outsiders. As such, they colonized the other, previously unpopulated worlds around their system to prevent other species from establishing colonies themselves. Back on Uvenna, Shistavinen built a strong commercial legislature that heavily favored them in dealings with off-worlders. They also openly preferred to keep to their own kind. In general, they had attitudes similar to the Selkath of Manaan, although the galaxy disliked them less for it. Despite their isolationist stance, they still kept up to date with technological advancements, with most Shistavinen using modern technology in their day-to-day lives. Some very few were what we might call lone wolves, Shistavinen that left their packs behind and ventured out into the galaxy, often finding employments as scouts, bounty hunters, mercenaries, and other solitary professions. The rest of the galaxy was mostly unfamiliar with their species, given how rare a sight they were off Uvenna Prime, and many found their predatory appearance to be downright frightening. But our favourite tidbit about this lupine race was the werewolf myth surrounding them. With their wolfmen appearances, they absolutely resembled werewolves, and while it's unclear if werewolves were a thing in Star Wars, there was absolutely a story about Shistavinen reacting to the moonlight. As the horror story went, the moon of Lupal was illuminated by a red sun, and when that reflected moonlight touched a Shistavinen, they would transform into a feral beast. Unlike the lithe Shistavinen, the next species on our list for today were big, bulky, and slow. We're talking about the Hergligs, a species of aquatic sentients that were famous for their gentle personalities, their technology, and their advanced astronavigation. Native to the planet Giju, Hergligs had adapted well to their water-filled environment. Giju, an aquatic world, was covered with large bodies of water, whether that was oceans, marshes, or even glaciers. The little land it did have was in the form of islands or smaller continents. The Herglics themselves seem to have evolved from aquatic mammals that had once populated their planet's waters. Over time, they shed many aquatic features, such as fins, and replaced them with more land-appropriate arms and legs. However, they still maintained many features suited to marine life. They breathed out of a blowhole situated on their heads, similar to whales in our universe. Their skin, which tended to be black or light blue, was smooth, hairless, and oily, which might have offered waterproofing. Their heads were large and bulbous, having no neck or chin to speak of, and their mouths contained rows of tiny, sharp teeth. What was most impressive about the Herglics, however, was their size. They were between 1.7 and 2.2 meters tall, which is quite respectable, but they were often just as wide. These massive creatures dominated any space they entered, a fact that many Herglics were actually self-conscious about. Easily twice the size of most other sentients, Herglics often felt as if they were comically oversized when trying to navigate off-world facilities. Doorways required delicate maneuvering, and anything with chairs was guaranteed to require 2 seats. Despite how awkward they might feel, Herglics loved meeting new people and exploring faraway places, and they often handled such awkwardness with grace. Overall, they were known for their docile, calm natures and pragmatic mentalities. Contrary to what you might expect, the Herglics were quite technologically advanced. They discovered the hyperdrive very early on and began colonizing their neighbor systems around the same time that the Corellians took to the stars. Archaeological finds revealed evidence of a Herglic empire that had collapsed about a millennium before they made contact with the rest of the galaxy. This ancient Herglic trade empire formed just after the fall of the Infinite Empire, and it ruled the southern core for 10,000 years before it was destroyed in the Herglic Crush. Archaeologists speculated that the Herglic trade empire was so technologically advanced that they would have outdone even the Galactic Empire. Machines were uncovered in Herglic space that seemed to harness the power of gravity, which probably just sent shivers down some of your spines. Much like the Duros, these gentle giants loved exploring and trading. From the beginning, they traded with the Galactic Republic, but it wasn't until 13,000 BBY that they officially became a member. Their scouts were key in mapping out the Rimmer trade route, and their tradesmen worked with the Jedi on Coruscant for various contracts. That said, successful industries are the first to be nationalized by totalitarian governments. When the Galactic Empire rose to power, they immediately nationalized all of Gidru's industry. The native Herglics tried to fight off their occupiers, but their sweet, docile natures were no match for the brutality of the Empire. After countless Herglics were slaughtered, the rest made peace with their situation and completely submitted to the Empire. Just so we don't leave on such a sour note, here's a fun tidbit about the Herglics. They would clear their blowhole right before a statement to mark how important it was, much like humans clear their throat. This would make a sound that became a legit word in Herglese, their language, and was then integrated into the everyday language in the Tapani sector. If you've ever played World of Warcraft, this next species might seem familiar. Thespiasians were a snake-like species native to the planet Thespias in the expansion region. The most noticeable thing about them, as you can imagine, is how they seem to be half humanoid, half snake. Their upper bodies presented a lot of humanoid features, such as 4 arms and substantial facial hair, while their bottom half was 2 meters of tail, powerful enough to propel them across Thespias' rocky surface, as well as to carry heavy objects. When they rested, these tails would curl up underneath them. As for their facial hair, their beards had evolved as a way to protect them from biting synats. Combined with their long, flowy hair, it didn't leave much of their faces uncovered. Often, their hair color matched their scales, which shed like snakes do. Although they usually shed their skin every few years, they groom themselves in between full body sheds by applying oils and lotions to their scales and picking off any dead or flaking ones. Something interesting is that, although they possessed 4 arms, they never used all 4. The 2 upper arms were stronger and larger, like a dominant pair, and it was considered low class to leave the bottom pair exposed. Thus, Thespiasians who wanted to appear classy wore clothes that could hide their lower arms, such as loose shirts or tunics with only 1 set of armholes. Some Thespiasians even went so far as to bind these arms to their bodies, as if trying to pretend they didn't exist at all. We'd hate to imagine how they would feel visiting Carcarus. Working class Thespiacians didn't have the same hang-ups, and the strength they displayed with their lower arms made xenobiologists believe that the high-class Thespiacians' lower arms had atrophied over the years due to disuse. When it came to resting, they didn't typically require a lot of sleep. They slept only a handful of hours a day, but that rest was broken up into small bursts of meditative trance that could last minutes or hours. This healing trance was necessary for their health as it provided neurological repair. If a Thespiacian wasn't able to get adequate rest, they could suffer neurological damage that resulted in mood swings and irritability. Then again, we feel pretty much the same way when we don't get enough sleep. Although they were omnivores, they were still reptilian. As such, they loved eating live food, including insects, birds, and rodents. Like snakes, their jaws would unhinge so they could swallow their prey whole. To most off-worlders, this was understandably a very unsettling sight, so when in the company of non-Thespiacians, they opted for cooked, very much unalive food. When they feasted in their own company, however, they'd have live animals in cages in the center of the table, which they would pull out as desired, dip into various sauces, then swallow whole. As people, they prided themselves on their dignity and self-control. When interacting with others, especially those from other species, they did their best to appear calm and collected. As a society, they were ruled by a single monarch whose line went all the way back to the beginning of the Galactic Republic. Many Thespiacians considered the monarchy to be an antiquated, obsolete, and unnecessary relic that squandered taxpayer funds. The Thespiacian royal line at least tried to stay up to date and relevant, but their efforts were spasmodic and infrequent. The monarchy, at least, was more of a symbol than anything else. A democratically elected parliament handled most of the governmental duties. A fun fact about the Thespiacians is that, near the time of the Clone Wars, their royal heir, Oppo Rensesis, was surrendered to the Jedi Order. He soon ascended to the rank of Jedi Knight. When his sister, the second in line to the throne, was killed, he was called back to take the throne, but refused, choosing instead to continue serving the will of the Force as a Jedi. It's unclear how long Thespiacians live for. Legend states they can live upwards of 90 years, but that seems like an understatement. Master Rensesis was born in 206 BBY, and during the Battle of Naboo, he was still alive and well, serving as a member of the Jedi Council. He was even quite active during the Clone Wars, fighting in several key battles, such as the Siege of Seleucami. The next species we're going to talk about was probably one of the most unlucky ones we've ever covered on this channel. We're talking about the Baelosars, a species of near-human sentience that not many people have ever heard of. Baelosars were native to the planet Baelosar in the core worlds, and their history and evolution is so tied to their homeworld that we need to talk about it first so everything else makes sense. Located in the core worlds, Baelosar was first discovered during the Great Manifest period, sometime between 20,000 and 17,000 BBY, and joined the Corellian hegemony soon after its discovery. The planet was most notable for its incredibly lax environmental law protections, and if you're even slightly familiar with how the galaxy works, you can already see where this is going. Looking to take advantage of the lax legislation, many megacorporations flocked to this world. The planet's industry soon began to flourish, and as a result, the pollution began to worsen. Soon, the planet was a disgusting, poverty-stricken husk of factories. Towers and skyscrapers stretched so far into the sky that they blotted out the light to the people below. Toxic fumes were pumped into the atmosphere until the very air of the planet became a barely breathable concoction of poisonous gases. And in this toxic hellscape, the Baelosars managed to survive, but they were by no means thriving. Enveloped in toxins and tormented by poverty, it's no surprise that the Baelosars lived an average of 64 years. Their poor health reflected in their outward appearance. Many seemed incredibly pale, both from malnutrition and lack of sunlight. They were underweight and appeared sickly and barely grew taller than 1.6 meters. The feature that most distinguished them from humans was their retractable antenna palps, two stalks on the top of their heads that allowed the Baelosar to listen into the subsonic range. They could also detect surges in emotion and thus foresee some dangers that were common in their crime-filled world, and this combination confused many a Jedi into thinking they were force sensitive. Another distinguishing feature was their immunity to toxins and poisons. Surrounded by poison from the moment they came into the world, Baelosars had adapted to resist most toxins. Not so coincidentally, this immunity also let them consume an ungodly amount of spice. But let's back up a moment. We mentioned that Baelosar was a world of factories and poverty. There wasn't a lot of wealth to go around, so most of the locals resorted to crime. Something else that was notable about Baelosar were its underground cave systems in which the Baelo mushroom grew. Early on, corporations realized this mushroom could be used to manufacture death sticks, which rapidly evolved as an industry on the planet. Baelosars not only worked for the death stick production facilities, but also consumed them liberally. Baelosar death sticks were in such competition with the real spice produced on Ryloth that the Baelosars and Twi'leks hated each other with a deep passion. Despite this, when the Baelosars eventually expanded into the underground cave systems during the time of the Galactic Empire and irreparably ruined their crop, they opted to work for the Ryloth spice producers in order to keep making a dishonest living. As you can imagine, choosing to stay on Baelosar wasn't at the top of the list for many of its natives. Many left the planet to seek opportunities for employment or education elsewhere in the galaxy, but they usually had a criminal record that made assimilating difficult. They were seen as aloof, cold, and immoral by many galactic citizens, even the young Baelosars that were sent to get an education in a better place. Here's a tidbit that's absolutely not depressing in the slightest. The galaxy was so confused by the Baelosars' personality that they wrote scientific papers on them. To quote, they were considered to be spineless, depressed, sarcastic, cynical, and selfish. The galaxy struggled so much with the idea that a poverty-stricken species that lived in a toxic wasteland and subsided on death sticks and mercy would be cynical and depressed that they had to have the Journal of Personality and Galactic Psychology study them in order to learn that these were not, in fact, innate personality traits, but the results of their society's failure. We're just as shocked as you are. Yet, somehow, there was another species that had it even worse than the Baelosar did. Also hailing from the core worlds, the Rin were yet another victim of the galaxy's oppression. They were nomads, moving from planet to planet, often in groups. If they once had a homeworld, it was long forgotten. As a species, they had two stories about how they came to be in the core. The first said that a huge group of them, all of them musicians, had been brought to a world where they lacked art, and that group had thrived. The second said that they had been soldiers once, dropped off into the core to defend against an inner rim threat. Standing between 1.4 and 1.8 meters tall, Rin were most distinguished by their very large, prehensile tails, their shock of white hair, and their beak-like noses. Their complexion ranged from light purple to blavy, which contrasted sharply with their long, pale hair that ranged from beige to pure white. Their eyes had more common hues, from browns, blues, and greens. The Rin were well known for their musicality and dedication to cleanliness. They could play their beaks like instruments, producing such precise sounds it could confuse technology. However, that wasn't really what the galaxy focused on when it came to the Rin. They had naturally cautious, secretive natures and oral tradition over written records, and that earned them quite the reputation. Combined with their nomadic ways and their penchant for gambling, like the sabacc they claim to have invented, the galaxy often considered them frauds and cheats. People were so prejudiced against them that their language was outright banned in many places, where it was believed the Rin would try and collude with one another. It was even legal to hunt or enslave a Rin specifically. Many of their women were even kept as breeding stock for more slaves. Due to how horrifically the galaxy treated them, most Rin hung around the corporate sector where they felt safest. For most of their history, they faced oppression and persecution wherever they went. During the Yuuzhan Vong War, however, they set up an excellent information network that helped in the fight against the Vong significantly enough to skew galactic opinion in their favor, for once. But let's step away from the darker side of galactic society and let's take a look at something literally dark, the Defel, commonly referred to as wraiths. These small sentients were highly unusual. Barely reaching 1.5 meters in length, they earned their nickname because, to most other beings, they were barely visible. You see, the Defel were native to the planet Uf-El in the Outer Rim, and their homeworld was a very unusual one. You see, Uf-El orbited an ultraviolet supergiant. Uf-El also had no ozone in its atmosphere. These two factors combined meant that ultraviolet light poured down on Uf-El's surface. But Uf-El did have an atmosphere, one made up of heavy gases that blocked out most other wavelengths of light. As a result, to humans and many other alien species, the surface of Uf-El seemed dark, shadowy, and gloomy, with very little light. The Def-El's dark skin seemed to meld with the shadows of their homeworld, and many off-worlders struggled to see them at all. But the Def-El weren't dark at all. In fact, they were quite bright and colourful. To their eyes, the skin of their snouts was green, whereas their throats and jaws had a bright orange colour. Their hair also shone blue to yellow. But these colours were only visible in the UV spectrum, so most other sentients could never appreciate their true colours. We see this happen in nature all over the galaxy. Even here on Earth, countless animals have markings and incredible colours in the UV spectrum that humans can't see. Birds are a great example. If you look at a regular crow, its feathers would look black to you. To other crows, however, who can see into the UV spectrum, crow feathers shine all colours of the rainbow, from blue to red to purple and green. One side effect of their planet's unique light situation was that all creatures that had evolved there could only really see into the UV spectrum. Even the dimmest of lights at other wavelengths was bright enough to blind them, so Def-El who ventured off-world or interacted with off-worlders usually wore some type of eye protection to shield themselves from light blindness. Something else worth mentioning about Uf-El is that the planet had unusually high gravity. It was overall not the easiest place to live on, so Def-El's society focused on community and helping each other out. They lived together in underground cities and shared resources, cooperating to survive. As such, they developed a strong sense of justice and accountability. Keeping your word was crucial on a world where you didn't have much, so to the Def-El, few things were as bad as dishonesty. When it came to industry, the Def-El primarily focused on mining. Uf-El was the only source of millennium in the galaxy, and as such, they developed highly advanced mining techniques to extract it and other ores from Uf-El's subterranean ore deposits. They hadn't really developed agriculture or space travel, but after their world was discovered by the galactic community, they didn't really have need of either. Not that many off-worlders came to Uf-El. Thanks to the planet's incredibly high gravity, takeoff was very fuel costly, and not every spacecraft had the power to escape its pull. Those who visited with any regularity were either mining corporations, such as Vulcan Minerals, who traded with the Def-El yearly, or metallurgical research teams who wanted to study the unusual ores. Given how rarely they were visited and how they lacked the means to leave on their own, very few Def-El ever made it out of their system. That, combined with their unusual characteristics and appearance, made most people believe they didn't exist. The few that did venture out into the galaxy usually found work as metallurgists or assassins, taking advantage of their unique traits and skill sets. Another four-armed species that's not as talked about are the Zexto that were native to the planet Troikan in the Outer Rim. Zextro had a very striking appearance. They were stick-thin, with most of their biomass dedicated to their 6 limbs. Despite how spindly they were only 1.4 meters tall on average, which is roughly the height of 11 cans of Coke stacked on top of each other. Much like the stick insects they might remind you of, Zexto evolved to live in the woodlands of their homeworld. Their pale skin and long thin limbs let them blend into their surroundings. This was important as they had to protect themselves from chalat eaters, a native predator that hunted them. Of their 6 limbs, 4 were used as arms with 6 fingers each, and 2 as legs, with 10 toes each. They had long, thin necks with small heads, and their oval-shaped eyes were dark, usually black, red, or purple. Their skin could range from light blues and purples to green or yellow, but always staying in the more pastel side of the color wheel. Females of their species could grow eyelashes and brown hair. The most interesting fact about them, however, was that their brains were split in 2 and located in different parts of their body. The half that was located in their cranium was responsible for basic emotions and bodily functions, while the half that was in their chest cavity managed the more complex aspects of sentience, such as logic, imagination, creativity, and memory. Due to the dangerous environment they evolved in, Zexto developed a penchant for thrill-seeking. Although they were usually calm and level-headed, they craved adrenaline rushes and took great offense if one called them a coward. Their hunt for a thrill and natural dexterity made them ideal pod racers, and as you can imagine, they took to the sport like Gungans to water. One of the most successful and well-known pod racers, Gasgano, was actually a Zexto. You might remember him from episode 1. The galactic community first made contact with the Zexto around the same time they did with the Belosars around 17,000 BBY. The person who first encountered them, an Icanian scientist looking to continue his research in secret after it was outlawed by the Galactic Senate, came upon the tribes of hunter-gatherers. From Troikan, he relocated a small population onto the neighboring world of Kiamia, where, through genetic experimentation, he created a new species, the Quermians. After some time, the Arcanian abandoned both his research and his creations, fearing the Republic would discover his work and take action. The two species eventually advanced their technology, and by the time the Republic scouts rediscovered them, they were ready to join the galactic community. Jumping across the galaxy, we had another unusual species, the Rishi. This species of meat-eating avian sentience was native to Rishi and were some of the friendliest aliens we've likely talked about on this channel. Standing at about 1.6 meters tall on average, the Rishi were humanoid in shape with many avian characteristics. Their bodies and faces were coated in feathers that could be brown or white. They also had beaks and sharp, eagle-like yellow eyes above which stood a tall, feathered crest. Their two arms were essentially wings with three-fingered, agile hands at the very end, giving them both the ability to fly and manipulate tools. Their feet were also bird-like, with four-toed, taloned toes supporting their weight. Another bird-like characteristic of theirs was speech mimicry. They could perfectly reproduce any sound they heard, whether that was an unusual animal cry or spoken language. This helped them pick up foreign languages incredibly quickly, although many off-worlders took the Rishi's mimicry as mockery at first. Their homeworld, Rishi, was a tropical paradise covered in lush vegetation, oceans, lakes, rivers, and mountain ranges, and the Rishi managed to blend in harmoniously. Despite their ability to make and use tools, they still chose a fairly primitive lifestyle, living in small tribes known as nests in the higher altitude regions of their homeworld, far away from the humidity of the warm and tropical beaches. These tribes were little more than a few families organized under a chieftain. As we mentioned, they were extremely friendly, living in harmony not only with other nests nearby, but even with off-worlders that came to their world. Some nests even traded with the colonists that settled the lowlands, looking for things that were shiny like starships and other metals. They weren't interested in using the technology they traded for, however, instead choosing to use it as decoration for their nests. For hunting, Rishi preferred to use their traditional weapon, the sling, which each Rishi would build for themselves. When not using a weapon, they also hunted by flying high and swooping down to grab their prey in their talons like many raptors. Although Rishi weren't known for fighting, they were also proficient with weapons such as spears and axes. They had to develop such a proficiency with weapons due to the large number of predators native to their homeworld. One of these predators, however, stood out to the Rishi. The Morngur were a massive species of predators that grew up to 3 meters in height. Normally, they lived in the polar regions of the planet, which were quite warm as far as poles went. In the valleys, they hunted native herbivores and mostly kept to themselves. However, in the warmer seasons, they sometimes ventured up the mountain ranges where the Rishi made their nests, and whenever they encountered them, the Morngur wouldn't hesitate to hunt the Rishi, and the Rishi let them. You see, in their native faith, the Morngur were sacred. Their name was the Rishi word for a spirit of violence. The Rishi believed these hulking predators were the incarnation of evil and violence, something that had to be respected and even worshipped. Killing them was strictly prohibited, even in self-defense. As we mentioned earlier, when the first settlers came to Rishi, they built their settlements and spaceports in the lowlands, which the Rishi didn't mind. The two groups even established trade relations. Though the natives weren't very forthcoming about their own traditions, they were welcoming to the Offworlders and never instigated conflict over territory or resources. During the Clone Wars, the CIS sent an invasion force to Rishi as the planet was rich in exonium ore, which the Confederacy needed to power their sonic weapons. A battalion of Geonosian soldiers arrived planetside and promptly took over the Rishi's exonium mines, kicking the locals out. In response, the Republic and Jedi Order both sent forces to protect the locals and help them take back their mines, hoping to deprive the CIS of the resource in the process. The clone trooper regiment sent by the Republic arrived first and rendezvoused with a Rishi nest, which they would cooperate with to rout the Separatists. Despite knowing a Jedi task force was on its way, the Rishi chieftain refused to wait longer and ordered the attack on the mines. The Geonosians had fortified their positions, however, and held fast against the Republic assault. When the Jedi task force, led by Jedi Master Kit Fisto, finally arrived, the tide of battle turned as Fisto almost single-handedly took care of the problem, resulting in the liberation of the Exonium mines and the routing of Separatist forces. As a fun fact about the Rishi, a study the Rinal State Medical Academy published in 22 BBY claimed their species was in the top 10 list of species most vulnerable to air pollution. The research paper studied the effects of standard industrialization and everyday traffic on the Rishi and concluded that, if exposed to air pollution, they were prone to developing pulmonary diseases like lung rot and silica lung. Luckily for the Rishi, they preferred to stay on their primitive world, where the air was clean and the traffic almost non-existent. The last species we'll be looking at today are, canonically, some of the most powerful in the galaxy. We're talking, of course, about the Dashade, a giant species of reptilian sentience that were known for eating Force users and being resistant to their powers. Standing between 1.7 and 2 meters, these muscular giants didn't have the friendliest faces to look at. Their skin ranged from black to olive green, and their small, beady eyes glowed black, orange, or red. Their most notable feature, however, was their jaws. They had a lamprey-like mouth with many rows of teeth that jutted out. Their powerful arms ended in sharp claws that could easily rip flesh from bones, which was coincidentally one of their favorite pastimes. On top of being resistant to Force attacks, they were also resistant to radiation, possibly due to their homeworld, Urcorp. Urcorp was located in the Outer Rim, and although not much is known about it, it's likely to have had a toxic atmosphere inhospitable to most other life forms. It was located in the Kron cluster, not far from Ossus. Finally, Dashade could dissipate heat along their epidermis, which made them harder to detect using standard methods like heat vision. Thanks to their considerable physical strength and many resistances, Dashade warriors excelled in professions where killing was involved, such as mercenary work and assassinations. The best of these Dashade assassins were known as the Shadow Killers, and they had a reputation for being unstoppable throughout the galaxy. This, it turns out, was the main reason they weren't wiped out during the Great Sith War. When the Kron Rift supernova exploded in 3996 BBY, the homeworld of the Dashade, Urcorp, was completely destroyed, taking with it almost their entire population. However, some Dashades survived. One Dashade, Snar Extruct, made an unlikely friendship with a Jedi Master and followed him to the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, where they became sparring partners. Extruct would remain on Coruscant and serve as a combat instructor for the Jedi Order. On Foleen, 38 Dashade Shadow Killers had been employed by a noble house. When Urcorp was destroyed, the Foleen chose to cryogenically preserve the Dashade warriors so that, one by one, they could be reanimated when there was a need for them. A more interesting survivor, however, was Kemval, one of the most powerful Shadow Killers of his time. Kemval had been scouted by none other than Tulak Horde himself, Dark Lord of the Sith, and brought on as his personal assassin. When the Dark Lord eventually passed, Kemval was sealed in his tomb on Korriban, where he would remain for the next several hundred years until he entered into the service of another Sith Lord. Alongside Kemval, several other Dashades served until the time of the Cold War, some 300 years after Urcorp's destruction. This wouldn't be too notable, as several members of their species had been observed living for many centuries. What is unusual, however, is that Dashade mercenaries participated in the Great Jedi Purge millennia later, leading researchers to conclude that, prior to the destruction of Urcorp, the Dashade had established colonies off-world where their population survived annihilation. As a final fun fact, it isn't explicitly stated in any of the written sources that Dashade had the habit of eating their kills. Kemval, however, makes it abundantly clear that not only did he hunt Jedi, but he also ate them. They were, in fact, his favorite meal, and anyone who's traveled to Ossus in Star Wars The Old Republic would be able to reunite with him while he's busy eating the Jedi survivors. But with that, we have to wrap up this video on the lesser loved species of Star Wars. However, we've really just only scratched the surface. Are there any other minor species you'd like us to cover in a future video? Did we talk about any species you'd never heard of before? Let us know in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.